So you see parts that are, if are extracted from the context, like him saying, "What? Oh," but if you just take that and put it in real life.
Sorry, could you do that again quickly?
"Achoo!"
That was very good.
Oh,
That was
thank
very,
you.
very convincing.
You did better than the actor did.
Hello and welcome to The Last Picture House, the film podcast that's just like the video stores of old. Membership's free, the summaries and reviews are unnecessarily personal, and our selection has some notable gaps in taste. I'm your host, Marcus Mr. White Lovett, and joining me beside the laminated catalogs are regular panelists Maria Mr. Blue Suzuki and Ian Mr. Pink Norton.
I think I should be Mr. Green, given how sick I'm feeling today.
No, you're Mr. Pink. This special episode, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We'll detail our responses to the film and how it sits alongside the director's previous movies. And if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on iTunes, podcast player, or your preferred podcasting app. So we managed to catch one of the first Japanese screenings of the film at the ungodly hour of 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And frustratingly, we avoided talking about the film immediately afterwards. I think I can speak for all three of us when I say the film gave us lots to talk about. Ian, would you describe yourself as a Tarantino fan?
I think up until Jackie Brown, yes. I loved Reservoir Dogs, I love Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, but in most recent stuff, I've not really been as much in love with.
So by recent stuff, you're referring to everything he's done since the 90s?
Pretty much, yes. Although I did like Death Proof, that he did the double feature with Rodriguez.
You like that?
I like Death Proof, yeah. Planet Terror, maybe not so much, but yeah, I enjoyed the Tarantino. It's just, something like Django Unchained really didn't work for me. I didn't enjoy it at all.
Why was that?
I think something we'll discuss later, but I think Tarantino films are always Tarantino films. They're very much, his fingerprints are on every single scene. And I just didn't think it worked, as him taking on the cowboy genre and then putting into that his type of violence and stylized stuff. I really didn't think it worked. Same as like you get in, Guy Ritchie directed a musical recently, and it doesn't work.
Aladdin.
Yeah, that was it.
How about you, Maria?
I love Tarantino's writing. I love his screenplays. I agree with Ian in terms of I am not a fan of violence for violence sake. So I kind of switch off at some parts of Tarantino's film. For Django Unchained, I loved it until there was this endless scene of like firearming and on the notes of rap. I thought it was a little bit too much for me.
Yeah, it's just gratuitous by that point, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with Tarantino's gratuitous violence because I think that that's part of what he does. It's part of his style. What I do have a problem with is the length of the story and whether or not the story is going someplace. The most recent films, Django Unchained, even going back to Kill Bill, I mean, there he needed 2 films to tell a story, which probably could have been 1. So the lack of economy, I think that he doesn't need to have this big baggy story to get his point across.
Yeah, I think there's parts of Kill Bill I really love. But again, it's the same point that you're making, Marcus. If he can do 10 versions of something or fit in 10 extra stories, he will do. It takes away from, I think, the form of the film itself. You can see with Kill Bill, he needs a stronger editor that's going to stand up to him and say, no, you can't do that, or that's not going to work.
How about The Hateful Eight?
The Hateful Eight, I think there's one part that I would have easily cut out, which is kind of behind the scenes, the reveal of something that happened, and there's this part that I was totally non-fundamental to the whole line of the story. So I think his movies could use longer stop at the editing room.
Previously on The Hateful Eight, there was that sequence. It was the second to last or maybe second to last sequence where we see what's taken place at the old inn prior to the arrival of the carriage carrying the main characters. And that was something that, had that been told in a different way, had it been show, don't tell, it would have worked a lot better for me. That section of the film really stood out as something that didn't really need to be there in terms of storytelling.
Yeah.
How did you feel about Inglourious Bastards?
Not one of my favorite films, for a variety of reasons. We'll get to, I think, the history part of it later on, but there were characters that I struggled to engage with. If you're going to make a World War II movie, and you're going to make a Hollywood 1950s style World War II movie, there are tropes. He hit those tropes, but at the same time, it was wandering off on its own themes at various points, and it didn't feel like it was a cohesive whole. It does have that great opening sequence, and I think we'll all agree that the opening with Christopher Waltz is absolutely superb. Ian, what baggage do you bring to a Tarantino film?
I think with the Tarantino film, you're always watching a Tarantino film. I think he's as much a part of the film as any of the lead actors or anybody else. And I think when you watch Tarantino film, you know it is. And that brings with it good things, like the choice of music, often a very good script, very good interplay between the actors and one-liners. But it also brings with it, it's a Tarantino film. You're never escaping from the fact that he is the star of his films.
So you're saying that regardless of the actors, the director, the writer, it's all there on the screen, and you don't stop being cognizant of that.
Yeah, you're always aware it's a Tarantino film, so you never sort of get that suspension of disbelief. You never forget, like, even with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I'm supposed to be watching a period piece, but constantly I'm aware that this is a Tarantino period piece. His fingerprints are everywhere on it.
But that's always been the case with
Yes,
his films.
yeah, of course.
I mean, going back to the early films, Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, you were very, very aware that this was somebody who was borrowing from all over the place, knew all these different films, and was putting it all on the screen for you to enjoy as a Tarantino film.
And I think he needs to show you how much he knows and how smart he is. Sometimes that can grate as well. You don't get to sort of get lost in the film itself.
How about you, Marie?
Well, I do bring three things. I bring my expectation for at least one iconic scene and one quotable line, if not more. And especially after Pulp Fiction, one badass female character. So for iconic scene, I'm thinking about the whole Jack Rabbit Slim sequence in Pulp Fiction. Or for great lines, I mean, a lot of great lines. Gentlemen, you had my curiosity, now you have my attention. To I Love You, Honey Bunny. Badass female characters. Mia Wallace, she was my myth when I saw the film. And I can ad-lib all her lines. The Bride, Ora Nishi, Shosanna in Inglourious Basterds, and of course Jackie Brown.
What about you, Marcus?
Tarantino is somebody who loves cinema.
Yeah.
And I like to think that I'm somebody who loves cinema. I certainly haven't seen all the films that Tarantino has seen, but that passion that he brings to the stories he tells is something that I thoroughly enjoy. Tarantino, every time he releases a film, we've just seen his 9th film, he always brings something of his passion and puts it there on screen. And for anyone who's ever been watching late night films at the cinema, or VHS tapes of 1950s, 1960s horror movies, this guy, he is your guy. He's somebody who embodies that passion, and that's what I expect from Tarantino. Maybe sometimes we expect a little bit too much. We expect that he's going to work with it, he's going to bring something inventive to the pastiche, but for the most part, we're satisfied as audiences, and that's why every film he releases is an event.
Yeah, in those early films, I think this approach was kind of new and fresh and something different, but we've seen him do it, as you said, 9 times now. And I'd love to see him do something else, or maybe not just do the same.
So what, the cat's out of the bag?
I don't want to say he's a one-trick pony, but he might be, but it's a good trick, but I want to see other tricks as well.
I relate to him on the level that I used to watch late night television that was showing films from, in my case, 30s, 40s. So this kind of geeky, nerdy approach to cinema, I really can feel it as my own as well.
Hollywood, 1969. Television actor Rick Dalton, Leonardo DiCaprio, struggles to stay relevant at the end of Tinseltown's golden era. Supported by his stunt double, Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt, Dalton must choose between supporting TV roles and the promise of a career overseas in spaghetti westerns. By contrast, Dalton's neighbor, Sharon Tate's own star, is in its ascendancy. For her, Hollywood holds a promise of a bright future. So I think we can describe this film as hotly anticipated. Maria, what were your first impressions of the film?
This film has been defined a love letter to old Hollywood, and I love that too. So in that sense, this film had me at hello. It opens with a parody of a TV show in the 60s with the behind-the-scenes interviews done in the NBC style. So I was totally geared up at the beginning. Another thing that I want to point out is that Tarantino here does something that he never done on this scale before. One is dogs. I mean, there's the dog of Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character, and the chemistry between this dog and Brad Pitt.
Well, it's an early sequence where he's feeding the dog.
Yeah, I mean, the whole sequence with Cliff preparing his own meal and the dog's meal, and the two meals are pretty much the same level in terms of disgusting level and of messiness. So he's treating the dog like himself. And another thing is kids. So there's this extraordinary character with this child actor played by Julia Butters. I think she's 10 now. She's also doing other stuff, but we'll hear about her a lot, I think. She's a very, very extraordinary actor. And the scene with Leonardo DiCaprio, I mean, it's not so much the lines that she's delivering, it's the fact that she is talking about professionalism in acting, and she's saying that with a seriousness that it's so comical, delivered by an 8-year-old
Yeah, well, it's
kid.
it's the gravitas that she brings to
Yes.
it, and she talks like a Tarantino character for sure, but she brings this kind of seriousness, and it reminded me a lot of the little boy in Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. You remember there's that little boy on the cruise liner.
Yeah, and
with
Marilyn
Monroe.
Monroe has a problem about escaping because she's been locked in and she wants to escape.
So in the
But
cabin, she
in
can't
the cabin,
escape.
yeah, and there are this kind of
Little portholes.
round holes, but she can get out. And by the way, this is the scene that inspired Peter Pan's Tinkerbell. That she has that scene that she cannot get away from a vase or something.
The little boy, she's stuck in the porthole. He looks at her and says, well, I could help you, but of course that could be bad. Somebody could see.
But at the same time, I'm a minor, so
I'm drawn to you by your animal magnetism. Ian, first impressions.
I agree with a lot of what Maria said. It is definitely a love letter to old Hollywood, but it's a really long love letter. And it's a love letter that doesn't go anywhere till right up to the end. I don't want to discuss the spoilers towards the end of the film. I didn't hate it. It was interesting, but I'm not sure how entertained I was. There was really good parts to the film, but I'm not sure it hung together.
Great, well, let's start with that. The film is really following two characters. Rick Dalton, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, he's this fading actor, someone who's had a huge career in Hollywood, but he's kind of lost his mojo, right? And then there's his assistant/stunt double, more assistant really than stunt double, played by Brad Pitt, called Cliff Booth. And together they are going to different studios, and we see Dalton making these TV shows. At the same time, we have Sharon Tate. She and Roman Polanski have moved into the house next door to Dalton. When this film was first announced, the people were very nervous about how Tarantino would handle the Manson murders. In particular, would he exploit the story of Sharon Tate's death? Ian, how did he handle it?
I'm a really big true crime buff, so I don't want to say I was excited to see the Sharon Tate murders on film, but I was certainly looking forward to seeing what the Hollywood version of that story. But I was very worried about what Tarantino would do with that because, as I've said before, Tarantino films, he's always the main star. And I was worried how sensitively he would be able to handle the issue.
That story has been told many times before, on television, in film. Tarantino, I think we're all kind of nervous about it, right?
And the way that he handles it. And before I say that, I was quite surprised how much of the Sharon Tate story we got. I thought that was going to be in the background while we got a day in the life of these two, stuntman and the actor.
Sort of like the buddy story.
But it was, it's very much an integral part of the story. But the way that Tarantino chose to handle that was to not really handle it.
So
really
not to
tell it.
engage with it.
Exactly. We didn't get any of the backstory. We didn't get any of the reason why the family are there. And we got very little of Manson himself. I have a theory that the reason we don't get any of Manson is Manson, for whatever he was a very charismatic, charming presence. Absolute psychopath, but a very charming presence, apparently. And if you put Manson in the film, he becomes the main star. And then Tarantino's not the main star of the film anymore.
That's interesting. Maria, what did you make of the way that Tarantino looked at the Manson murders?
I kind of understand what he wants to make of it. He wants to make it as an impending shadow, so we all know what's going to happen. The things that we see, brief moment that we see Charles Manson visiting the house, or anything that's gonna chronologically put us closer to what's gonna happen. All the audience know what's gonna happen. So I think that is used to this flirting with the tragedy, makes everything much more somber, much more sad.
Isn't it just another kind of exploitation to use that story? Sharon Tate doesn't have a strong storyline. Isn't it that we're expecting the murders to happen? So it's another form of exploitation.
I think Tarantino is exploiting our expectation, like negative expectation of what's going to happen. So it's like a horror movie. We know that the tragedy is gonna kick in. So
And-
he's using that.
And if you haven't read about this, if you're a younger viewer and you're watching this film without any knowledge of the Manson murders, does it work, Ian?
I don't think this film would make much sense if you didn't have any knowledge of who Manson. I mean, I think everyone knows who Manson is, but if you don't know about that particular instance and what happened, I think the story, it would be a very difficult story to follow. Also, if you don't know anything about it and you go and look it up, please be very careful. It's a particularly horrific murder.
So the two male characters do have clear agendas. Dalton's character is trying to get trying to get his mojo back, while Cliff Booth is trying to make ends meet as this stuntman / assistant for Dalton. There's also Sharon Tate. She has no arc. She doesn't have a clear want. What did you guys make of this, Maria?
My motivation to see a Tarantino film is always to search for a cool, badass female character. Here, the main character is Sharon Tate, and to be nice about it, she's like a Barbie doll. So she's stunning, she's beautiful, but she's so bubbly. Okay, I get it. She's very happy to be in Hollywood, but from Tarantino's movie, she's a bimbo.
So this is something that was set up right at the beginning. She's on, as I said in the introduction, her star is in the ascendancy. She's very happy to be in Hollywood. She's had a kind of small success with a Dean Martin movie that is shown in the film.
Yeah.
But she doesn't have an arc. She really doesn't kind of progress. She doesn't have a clear want. What do you think was the direction that Tarantino gave her, Ian?
I mean, I don't know, because she's literally wandering around town doing nothing. And as Maria was saying, I thought she was going to be the main character in the story. There's nothing for her really to develop or to do. And Margot Robbie...
Does she need to be there?
I mean, I guess that comes down to how much of this they're trying to represent the true story of what happened to Sharon Tate. And Margot Robbie is a great actress. I wanted to see her given more to do, but it's just shots of her legs, shots of her in different outfits. There must be more to that story, because she's married to Polanski. That can't have been all happy.
This movie was in competition in Cannes, and at the press conference in Cannes, a question that was asked to Robbie was about the lack of lines of her character, meaning a lack of depth, and Tarantino answered for her, saying that that was not true. And in the meantime, they developed kind of a theory saying Sharon Tate is not a real character, is not a real person in the movie, but more a symbol of Hollywood's innocence.
Well, the symbol doesn't speak.
Or is she a symbol of the kind of the 60s as well?
The explanation that Tarantino and Margot Robbie, when she's answering with him, is that they're not looking for realism. They're not looking for making it a true character, but more making it like an angelic presence. But this theory doesn't really convince me.
No, the angelic presence thing doesn't work at all, because that is essentially saying that she's a cipher. We don't really know what she's doing, but she's something that symbolizes the future, symbolizes innocence. That's not good enough. If you're making a movie, if you're telling a story, you have to give people a reason to be there. I mean, this idea of the angelic female going back hundreds of years in the theater, it's always been So when you're restaging an old play, how do you deal with the fact that this woman has no lines and she's the person that the male hero is lusting after? And that's all she is for me. I mean, I found that really troubling, to be honest. I felt that there was a missed opportunity for her character to tell us something about either her life or what she wants or Hollywood at the time. The aspirations were those of a child. I mean, what we saw of her when she was watching the movie that she's in kind of an engaging sequence, admittedly, but we don't really see what it is that she's looking for. As scriptwriters would certainly note, she doesn't have a want.
And I think it's not just Margot Robbie's character. I think all of the women, maybe with the exception of one of the family members, are so 2D and cliched. I'd say the notable one is, what was her name, Squeeze? Or the redheaded lady that Brad Pitt talks to at the house. She has a little bit more about her. But even
So you're talking about like the Manson family property, or at least that's where they're shacked up in the Hollywood Hills.
But even the other then female members of the Manson cult, you get nothing more of them.
To put it in a word, the women in this film are ornamental.
Yeah, they're cosmetic.
Yeah. So they could be angelic or they could be fairies of Satan, like the Manson's family. But They're nothing more than a decoration in a totally male-driven story.
That's right. I mean, it is very much similar to, you go back to like 16th, 17th century theatre and you have the same sorts of characters. Women standing on balconies, men lusting after them, men talking about the women, but the women not actually having any kind of personality or reason. They're not self-actuating.
No.
Do you think Tarantino, I'm probably giving him too much credit here, but do you think he's doing it on purpose to show an example of that, as that's how women would have been treated in the period itself?
He seems to be enjoying it too much.
I was going to say there is that as well.
You know, Tarantino has always been blamed for misogynism, and this film doesn't...
Like a virgin.
that and the violence against women. But at least in the other films, the violence was equal. It was violence against men and violence against women. And as I said before, there were female characters that were really cool.
But they're self-actuating.
Yes,
They have
yes.
a drive. That's the thing that's lacking here.
There is no motivation. There is no self-expression of the women.
But let's talk for a moment about the Bruce Lee scene in the film. So about 1/3 into the film, Brad Pitt, stuntman, has a confrontation with a young Bruce Lee. What did you guys make of that scene? Ian?
I think it was wholly unnecessary and completely disrespectful to any memory of Bruce Lee, to the point where you think, does Tarantino have some kind of beef with Bruce Lee or the Bruce Lee estate or something like that? Because Bruce Lee comes out of it very, very badly. And apparently Bruce Lee's family is very offended by what happens.
Can we try and explain a little bit about how he comes out badly?
Well, he comes across as kind of, it's Bruce Lee doing one of the speeches that I think I've seen him do in an interview, a televised interview. So he's giving one of his speeches about his philosophy.
So we're backstage in Hollywood. Rick Dalton's stunt double, Brad Pitt, is about to go on and replace Rick Dalton in a big fight scene. Meanwhile, a young Bruce Lee is mouthing off about how he could take on Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and win. Cliff Booth laughs. This is hilarious to him. Bruce Lee questions, what do you think so funny? And here begins this kind of confrontation between the two. So Bruce Lee comes across as a kind of egomaniac in this scene.
Yeah,
He's talking about, pretentious, that he could kick anybody, that his hands are lethal weapons, he couldn't use them because he might kill somebody. And then it comes to his attention, it's whispered to him that Cliff Booth may or may not have had something to do with his wife's death. Nevertheless, he and Cliff have a confrontation, and Bruce Lee comes off looking, I guess, without spoiling anything, Bruce Lee comes off looking like a prick.
He comes off as a bad parody of his movies. So you see parts that, if are extracted from the context, like him saying, "What? Oh," but if you just take that and put it in real life.
Sorry, could you do that again, quickly?
"Achoo!"
That was very good.
Oh,
That was
thank
very,
you.
Very convincing.
He did better than the actor did.
So, but if you take that out and you put it in everyday life, of course it's going to be ridiculous. So what he does is that he takes what Bruce Lee looks in his films and parody it and put it in everyday life.
So the question becomes, is it unfair? And why is it unfair?
I think it's unfair, but it's also unnecessary. It does nothing for the story.
Yeah, it doesn't drive it.
drive the plot. It's basically us being shown why Brad Pitt's character isn't really employed as a stuntman anymore. So we find out he's a bit unreliable or a bit confrontational on set, but there was no need for it to be Bruce Lee.
Or you can invent a character that you may presume or identify as, but not make it Bruce Lee.
That takes me to another idea, and that is the film tends to tell, not show, a lot of the time. Unlike other Tarantino films, this is something I've always loved about his films, that he finds a way, at least in those early 3 or 4 films, and particularly in Jackie Brown, to show the way people are feeling or show the way that a character is being motivated and what's going to happen next. Here he brings out everything to telegraph what's going to happen. We always know what's going to happen to a character, why it's happening. It's overly explained. Did you also find that it was overly expository, Ian?
We're getting almost like the highlights of Tarantino's career. You're getting the horse riding from Django Unchained. You're getting the smaller scenes from things like Reservoir Dogs, the buddy dynamics you get in Pulp Fiction. But he just throws it all up there. And it felt like it's a whole bunch of these kind of in-jokes and nods to other things and other bits. It wasn't really working.
Yeah, the question for me is, does the film have enough in terms of stakes and an arc, or is it more pastiche and references? Now, I remember having this exact thought watching his early films, and looking back, I'm like, well, you know what? These films do have strong arcs. They have suspense. They have stakes. But with this particular film, I feel like, compared with even Kill Bill, I'm not invested in the characters.
Well, one big theme in Tarantino's films is revenge, and there's not even the revenge element here. I was listening to an interview Paul Thomas Anderson did after a screening to Tarantino, and he was saying that his choice of making it a day in the life of, as the film is because he feels that the characters are very strong, so they don't need to have a big arc. He can imagine a lot of backstories. Tarantino sounded pretty satisfied with the way he chose.
Day in the life of, like a Shaggy Dog kind of Altman type movie. Is that where he
Yeah, a day in the life of the struggling actor, like has-been actor of 1960s.
Okay.
And I think the other issue is everyone in the film looked like they were having a really, really good time and enjoying themselves. And I think Tarantino was enjoying himself.
But that doesn't always make a good film. We
No,
know
exactly,
This.
yes.
This is one of those truisms. If everyone does interviews and says how much fun they had on set, it doesn't always
translate.
equate to something.
It always rings
that you want
alarms for me if
Yeah.
you see them in the
With
press
maybe
junkets.
maybe with the exception of Wes Anderson, right?
Oh yeah, possibly.
One word that comes up to me is indulging. I felt that he was indulging in the scenes. The scenes are all pretty much 2 minutes, 3 minutes away from the real cut.
Yeah, and did we need that much of Brad Pitt driving a car around? You could have cut 20
Well, actually,
minutes.
you know what? I loved that. I thought that was one of the things I enjoyed the most in the film was the aesthetic. So maybe we can talk about that for a moment. The shots of Brad Pitt, this is the quintessentially LA thing, is driving around LA. And Brad Pitt driving around LA with the sound of the radio or the sound of noise, cinema, whatever it is, playing from outside, this kind of diegetic sound. I think that was a big part of the aesthetic for me and something I really liked about the film. And we talked about this a little bit with Roma. We talked about it with The Favourite, that the use of Foley and the use of music, but particularly Foley, to kind of create a sense of place. I think this is something that we've seen more and more in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
It wasn't there maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
No, yeah, we feel immersed in the story because the music, the background noise, everything is always something almost like a water that you're dipping in all the time.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen The Conversation, but that film was famously, the audio was done by Walter Murch, and the soundscape of that film creates a space. This film was very similar to me, that I felt constantly like I inhabited a space. One of the good things about the long takes was that you got to know the place. You felt like you understood the geography.
And I think that's great, but to make a video game reference, have any of you ever played Grand Theft Auto? Specifically Grand Theft Auto Vice City Edition? Because
Don't look in my direction.
and I'm looking where Di would normally be sat, but
GTA, yeah.
but that's what this film felt like. It's walking
No,
around
absolutely.
in a sandbox.
No, I had exactly the same response. And not only that, but it's LA, and that game is based, of course, on Southern California. So between the two, there was a matchup.
One of the scenes that I really loved was when it's dusk and LA is taking its probably like real identity. So all the neon lights are coming up and you can see the city being artificially lit. In that version of California Dreaming, so not the fast version, but kind of an acoustic version, that part I felt that it was like something that Tarantino doesn't do, which is melancholia.
I think for a moment we should talk briefly about Robert Richardson's photography, which is as good as ever in this film. Someone who's worked with Scorsese, he did The Aviator, he did Hugo, he's worked, I think, on 5 or 6 of Tarantino's films, and of course he got his start with Oliver Stone, and we really remember him from JFK and some of those kind of very big explosive films that he did with Stone back in the day. In this particular movie, Richardson captures, I think, a kind of very old school retro look, but at the same time makes it feel contemporary. I'm thinking again of the driving scenes that Ian found
I didn't
tedious.
Say, I didn't say I hated them. I just said we could have probably cut 20 minutes from them.
But the driving scenes, I felt like that's where we started to understand Brad Pitt's character. That, and as well as the feeding the dog scene. But as he's driving around, we see the bright lights of Hollywood. We see everything sort of through this, what photographers call bokeh, these reflections in the anamorphic lens moving from one side of the screen to the other. It felt like a big late 60s, 1970s picture to me, and I felt a sense of place. I really admire the way that they created a geography for this film.
No, I thought that was great. I thought the film looked amazing, and I do, like you say, like the location. You wanted to, as we said previously, in something like Akira, you did want to go there and walk around and kind of a look around the corners. But I think it was great they did create that location, and you truly believed that you were there. But I think also by doing that, it kind of slightly might alienate some of the audience as well, because I don't know enough about
Sure.
LA
I mean,
and Hollywood.
this was a similar problem in the second to last Paul Thomas Anderson film, in Inherent Vice. I mean, there was a lot of shaggy storytelling with people moving around LA. If you're not someone who likes to see somebody just being and driving, then maybe it's not the film for you.
But also another example would be at one point they go into a bar or a club, and down the street there's a premiere for what she calls the dirty movie pictures or something, and she says, "Oh, I didn't know they had premieres for those now." Now I instantly thought, am I supposed to know something about that? Is that something I'm
guessing it was like Deep
That
Throat or
was,
something.
no, I think the cinema was called Eros, and it existed. And then later on, it was bought by Mr. Tarantino himself, and it's currently in New Beverly.
There are some really good Easter eggs in this film. A lot of them I didn't get initially. I did a little bit of research.
And not to spoil anything, but there's another little Easter egg I liked when they were showing the Italian films. And one of the director's name is the name that Brad Pitt's character in Inglourious Basterds uses to get into the film premiere.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
showing that it's in the same universe. I quite like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of shared universe aspects to this, and you, Ian, also talked about the cigarettes.
Oh, Red Apple cigarettes.
Which are the cigarettes
And
that
then-
are smoked by Bruce Willis.
Bruce Willis in
Pulp Fiction. Yeah. So there's a lot of nods to what Tarantino did previously. So it's a
yeah,
joy
the
for
Tarantino universe.
It's an ode to Tarantino fans, of course.
The code name for the film was Magnus Opus. So this
the
is his.
the usual modesty of Mr. Tarantino. And one scene that I really laughed a lot, which there are not so many, but I really lost it, was that montage of all the films that Rick Dalton does in Italy. It's a very fun montage because it's not only sound, but it's also visual. There are a lot of fake posters that make you think of the 1960s poster. But actually, they were done by the same person.
Oh, wow.
There's this one artist, he's a painter who does the posters since the 60s, and it's called Renato Casaro. He's 83, and Tarantino got him to do parodies with Leonardo DiCaprio's face.
But it's not parody, it's pastiche at this
It's,
point.
yeah, at this point, it's pastiche. Going through a little bit, let me nerd out for this.
Please.
Because, you were mentioning the name that's used later on in Inglourious Basterds, which is Antonio Margheriti. It sounds phony, but it's a true director. It's a B-movies, Italian Western B-movies director that was very influential to Tarantino. Also, the other ones, so there's, of course, from the title, Once Upon a Time in the West, Once
Sure.
Upon a Time in America,
And
of
then,
course,
yeah,
it's
Once Upon a
Sergio.
Time in America, of course.
Yeah, it's Sergio Leone, but he never mentions him. If you pay attention, he never mentions the name. And the super agent played by Al Pacino.
I was
he's
hoping
great.
we'd get to him.
Yeah, we will get to him later. He talks about the second best spaghetti western director, which is Sergio Corbucci. Rick Dalton is supposed to work with, and he does Navarra Jim.
Navarra Jim.
Because Sergio Corbucci did something like Navajo Joe.
So Corbucci's a real person.
Sergio Corbucci is a real person.
And Sergio Leone is, I guess, the number one.
The number one. So the number two is Sergio Corbucci. Then we have Antonio Margheriti. And we have another guy who's Giorgio Ferroni. They all sound phony, but they're actually real directors.
But the real payoff is in the last of those spaghetti westerns presented in the montage. What's that called, Maria?
That's called Operazione Dynamite.
Operazione
Dynamite
And you
by
two-
Antonio Margheriti.
And you two lost it in the cinema when that
I
happened.
lost it.
It's brilliant. I mean, to be honest, I felt that was the best joke in the film.
Well, you
Yeah.
laughed so hard the guy sleeping on my shoulder woke up.
Finally. He was
Finally.
snoring so loud.
It was 9 a.m.,
Yeah,
late
yeah,
night on
yeah,
Friday.
yeah.
I think the one thing we can say is that we can't criticize Tarantino for not doing his homework before he made the film.
Sure, but are there more references than a story?
There's more reference than plot, that's definitely sure. So.
In the interview with Paul Thomas Anderson, Tarantino was saying that he is really resenting IMBC because he knows all the things by memory.
So he's somebody who wants to win the pub quiz.
Oh, yes, he does.
Oh, I would hate to do a pub quiz with Tarantino. That would be
Can you
awful.
imagine? Yeah, it's like
you
you know
know
when you go to the pub quiz and there's that soccer nerd who knows everything, like who won like best on field in 1973.
I love watching you trying to talk about sports, Marcus.
Yeah, I said best on field, whatever.
But you know that Tarantino would be the kind of guy at a pub quiz who would question every single question he'd come back with.
You're wrong.
Yeah. Or, sorry, do you mean this or this? Or I do have a question about Tarantino, though. Does Tarantino have a foot fetish? What is his obsession
What
with
made
showing?
you think of that?
What is his obsession with bare feet, dirty bare feet?
The way I took that was he had an idea for one character and then needing something to do with Sharon Tate's character gave that to her as well.
But it wasn't just that. So many of the scenes started from the feet up. Every time they got out of the car, it was straight onto Brad Pitt's shoe.
Starting on people's feet.
I know,
for
but
the, for the camera, I mean, that's like someone has arrived. I think that's a way of telling us what's happening with the character.
We had the innuendo when in Pulp Fiction, Uma Thurman's character just takes off her shoes for the dance competition, and it starts from all that. But actually, Sharon Tate was known for not loving to put on shoes. So she would go to restaurants and she would put like a lace around her ankle to show that she was wearing shoes, but she was not. So that kind of is in...
This came up in your research? How
did.
did you find
We
that?
do a lot of research.
Yeah, but that's good stuff.
Thank you.
You know, there's a long tradition of making films about Hollywood and behind the scenes. We have Sunset Boulevard and we have Hail Caesar, the Coens film. This is certainly, I think, one of the great industry movies. It captures an LA where everybody knows everyone. Everyone is in the business. Quentin Tarantino obviously loves LA, and the production design, the way it's shot, really reflects this. There's an incredible attention to detail. It's almost like a fetishistic film when it comes to the way it shows Hollywood in 1969. It was also interesting for me to see the response of critics to this film, looking at people based on the East Coast of the United States, here in Japan, the UK. Critics generally said, you know, this is kind of interesting, it's fun. The response was generally positive toward the film, but it was a little bit different in LA, on the West Coast of the United States. People love the film, and there are critics that I have a great deal of admiration for who have seen the film 4 times, 5 times. And this was a little surprising to me because I don't think it's necessarily a film I need to see anytime soon. But sure, if it's on late night TV, I'll watch it. But what I do think is it's a film about an industry, and if you're part of that industry, you will respond to it.
Exactly that. I was at a kid's birthday party yesterday, and most of the dads there are actually not Japanese but American. And one guy was saying that a lot of his friends from LA had seen the movie and absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
But then he said a lot of his friends who were not from LA had seen it and didn't get it, didn't
Yeah,
understand the
I'm guessing
obsession.
if you go to a multiplex in New Orleans, you're not going to have the same kind of response because there's a lot of nostalgia there. And there's a lot of people who I think are responding to the TV reruns, the Lancer type thing. And they're looking at that and going, hey, that's my childhood, that's something I remember. All that driving, that's the LA experience. But for people outside LA who are not part of the business, so to speak, I think they have a different reaction.
I think it's not that gripping, it's not that part of your personal history as people in LA.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be saying a lot of interesting things, but I think it's saying it in a language that perhaps I don't quite understand.
Maria, when I was looking at this film and thinking, okay, we definitely need to cover this in the podcast, I was thinking, okay, it's the end of the golden era. It's the end of the studio system. Did you feel that the end of the studio system was really covered in this film? Or like in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, do you feel like there was that transition?
I
that was
didn't
covered?
feel that it was covered properly. There are attempts of trying to portray a passing era or era of transition. For example, we hear from the radio that there are news about Vietnam. So you see that the attempts, but a really kind of childish attempt to me. It's like they're not treated in a sophisticated way enough to translate and to go to the audience.
So by comparison with something like Mad Men, where the whole story takes place over a period of a decade, and in my view at least, it captures the way that people deal with historic events, with change, and they're kind of subjects of change. They're not absolutely in control of what's going on.
Yeah, I think the TV series Mad Men does a way better job in portraying something that's finishing up, and people are not prepared, people are not equipped for the new era.
So the end of an era.
Yeah. So there's one scene, for example, that's when Leonardo DiCaprio get off the car, and you see all these cigarette butts and it makes you laugh, but it's been done so well in
Well,
Mad
in
Men.
Mad Men,
Yeah, the picnic scene.
the
They
picnic
finish
scene.
and they throw away everything.
Yeah, the picnic scene in Mad Men where they just dump all the garbage
They dump
and
everything.
leave it in the park.
Yes.
All right, so what did you make of the performances in the film? Ian?
Unusually for me, I really like Leonardo DiCaprio.
Unusually?
I do not like Leonardo DiCaprio. I find him very
Really?
difficult in a lot of films. I think.
Name a film that you don't like him in apart from Titanic.
Oh, I was definitely going to go Titanic.
No, so another film.
I was going to say films I do like him in. It's easier because I like him in Romeo and Juliet.
No, I want to hear that film, man.
I don't like him in pretty much everything. I really don't. I have trouble.
Names.
I'm trying to remember what's the one he does. Shutter Island. Don't like it.
Really?
I like the film. I don't like his performance in it. Inception. He annoys me. He's in Inception, isn't he? Yeah.
He is.
Yeah,
He's
he's
the
in
lead in Inception.
Yeah, good. Oh, my brain's so fuzzy now. I've got tired. But I do like him in Romeo and Juliet and what's he in Gilbert Grape. I think he's very good in. But yeah, I find him difficult. He'd be a reason sometimes that I don't watch something if Leo's in it. And I think Leonardo DiCaprio is very good in this. But I don't think he's anywhere near as good as Brad Pitt is. Brad Pitt, I think, was brilliant in this
Maria,
film.
you famously don't like Matt Damon. Does Leo upset you as much as Ian?
Well, I'm a recovering Leo hater because I used to hate him, but since my
12-step.
yes,
Actually, that's where I'm up to too as well, actually. I agree.
but I had to change my mind because I wanted to see the new Tarantino, which at the time was Django Unchained. So I had to, and then it's like, as he said, he got my attention. It's like he was so good, and so I realized that I really misjudged him, and then I started watching him in Martin Scorsese's movie, and now I can
Shutter
say
Island, Ian.
he has nothing but something to gain by getting older. He's really using his physicality.
Do you really have a hang-up about his age at this point? I mean, the fact is that he became famous when he was a teen.
I notoriously hated like Titanic. I hated that. I hate the.
What is it with you guys with Titanic? I mean, that was a long, long time ago.
I do have a question though, like in terms of casting, when you look at Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt, how in a month of Sundays do you decide to make Leo the movie star and Brad Pitt the stuntman? Because Brad Pitt's a movie star.
I totally agree with you on that one. And what about some of the other characters? There's a great cameo from Al Pacino, Ian.
Honestly, I would watch the film of Pacino's character. That was it.
You
was
want a spin-off,
wonderful.
right?
Yeah, I want a spin-off.
It's almost more than a cameo if you think about it. I mean, he's in it for a decent amount of time.
Yeah.
And he pops up again towards the end as well. So
he appears a couple of times, absolutely inhabits that character.
Oh, he's having so much fun as well.
The Hollywood agent who's trying to send Rick Dalton to Italy for spaghetti westerns.
And what was his name again, Marcus? I think you got it right.
Well, there was some debate about this, Ian. Thank you for throwing it to me. He's called Mr. Schwartz.
That's not how he pronounces it.
It's either Schwartz or Schwartz or
Schwartz.
Schwartz.
Call me Marvis.
So I think sometimes Tarantino can get these kind of performances out of his actors, like Christoph Waltz in Inglourious Basterds. I put it on the level of that kind of thing.
Well, isn't the movie really about actors? This film, at its crux, it's about actors, their place in Hollywood, this place in this town where everyone's in the business. And it's a celebration, if you like, of the way that actors are craftspeople but can get used up and spat out by the system.
I really thought Leonardo DiCaprio's part where he starts to fluff his lines and then goes back to the trailer and then comes back, I thought that was great.
It's great. It's been done, but it's
But
great.
it was great. But apparently DiCaprio had quite a lot of trouble with that part, like trying to act someone acting in a film
But
he struggled
I
with.
think that's extraordinary. The fact that he's playing an actor, playing a character who is convincing, then loses a line, goes back to Rick Dalton, goes back into the character, and then goes to his trailer and spits a dummy.
And then comes back and gives that performance.
Right.
I thought it was great. I thought it was really good.
Yeah, that whole sequence. I mean, it's a Western inside a film that's not a Western. You could argue it's the third Tarantino Western, couldn't you?
No, especially when he's talking to his new director, and the new director is just throwing like suggestion at him, and he really looks lost. It's like why?
If I wear a wig, people won't recognize me. And the director's saying, but you're an actor. I don't want people to recognize you. Act. That, I think, does capture the spirit of the late 60s, early 70s, and the way that things were moving in terms of getting away from the studio system and into, like, the new Hollywood. Capital N, capital H. Ian, final thoughts.
It's not that I hated the movie. So there was parts of it I found entertaining, but I really felt it was like Peter Biskin's Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, the seminal book on that period of Hollywood history, in that I really like the book, but I don't think I'd ever read it again cover to cover. I may pop in and read certain anecdotes, be they true or not, and I feel the same about the film. I would like to go back and watch certain scenes, especially Pacino, the young girl, but it's not a film I'm going to be watching again.
Maria.
This film shares the DNA of other films by Tarantino that I love, especially the love for cinema. Yes, I can totally relate to that. But it also enhances a part that I don't like about Tarantino, which is this boys' club, gentleman's club aspect. And I think here is really, really almost adverse to women. So I wish that it would open its membership to women too, and he would go back to write wonderful female characters that we can feel excited about.
And what are your final thoughts, Marcus?
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood lies exactly at the midpoint for me between Tarantino's best films, like Jackie Brown, Pulp Fiction, and the films I dislike the most, Inglourious Basterds, Death Proof. It's got the same mix of parody, pastiche, the same love of film that we've come to expect from Tarantino, but its failure to capitalize on Margot Robbie's presence, its lack of tension, its baggy storytelling, they prevent the film from ever really engaging the audience. With that said, I suspect the film will live on, like Dalton, not in the cinema, but on television. You've been listening to The Last Picture House. Be sure to let us know what you think of the show on Twitter, where we're at Last Peak House. Follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, where we're Last Picture House, one word. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.